Today at the National Press Club, the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, Anthony Albanese. Mr Albanese entered Parliament in 1996 and served as Deputy Prime Minister under Kevin Rudd. Today he speaks on a national agenda for more productive, sustainable and livable cities. Anthony Albanese with the National Press Club address from Canberra.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club and today's National Australia Bank address. We're very pleased to welcome back Anthony Albanese. He's been here often enough now that he doesn't need an extended introduction, I'm sure. But I know that today he's talking about one of his favourite subjects, livable cities. Please welcome Anthony Albanese.
Thanks very much, Ken. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country and pay my respect to their elders past and present. To members of the National Press Club, parliamentary colleagues, distinguished guests, particularly my family, Carmel and Nathan, who are here today, ladies and gentlemen. 42 years ago at Sydney's Blacktown Civic Centre, a great Australian made some important observations about whether the Commonwealth Government should have any involvement in urban policy in this country. He said this: "A national government which has nothing to say about cities has nothing relevant or enduring to say about the nation or the nation's future." That man, of course, was Gough Whitlam, launching his successful 1972 election campaign. Whitlam vowed that after 23 years of Conservative inaction on cities, a Labor government would prioritise urban policy, working with states and local government to improve productivity, sustainability and livability of urban Australia in the national interest. Whitlam's assessment of the importance of cities to life in this country is, I believe, even more relevant today than it was in 1972. Cities matter. They produce 80% of our GDP and are home to 4 of 5 Australians. Indeed, in the Asian century, they matter even more than they did in 1972. The opportunity for our nation is clear. By 2030, the Asia-Pacific region will have a middle class of 3.2 billion people, almost twice as many as Europe, the Americas, Africa and the Middle East combined. The current government has followed its Conservative predecessors and removed itself from involvement in our cities. By 2025, this region will produce over half of global output. Australia is fortunate to be at the world's economic epicentre. We must compete with our innovation, our skills and ability to deliver high-value outcomes. In the 21st century, productivity is the main weapon that we have to grow national wealth, lift living standards and stay in front in the battle for international competitiveness. Creative cities policy which boosts productivity will be critical to our success. It's often said that change is the only constant in life. Change is putting Australian cities under real pressure, pressure that will become more intense in coming decades. Our population is expected to double by 2050. By then, the populations of Sydney and Melbourne will be approaching 8 million people. In the interim, the ongoing rise of the digital age will trigger huge changes in the way we live and work, shifts that will have dramatic consequences for the way our cities function and the ways in which they need to adapt to be successful in the future. If we don't address these shifts, productivity growth will slow. The next Labor government must follow its predecessors in implementing urban policy which drives productivity, sustainability and livability. That's why today Labor leader Bill Shorten has announced that I will have Shadow Minister for Cities formally added to my title to emphasise Labor's priority in policy development before the election and implementation after it. The approach to cities is one of the great divides in Australian politics. The division is not over the nature of urban policy, but whether the national government has any role in cities at all. The current government has followed its Conservative predecessors. It is backward-looking. It dismantled the Major Cities Unit on literally its first day. It's abandoned the Urban Policy Forum. It's withdrawn from all public transport funding. As I've said before, the problem isn't that Tony Abbott is stuck in the past. It's that he wants the rest of Australia to go back there just to keep him company. We should use this period of opposition to develop a constructive and positive agenda for the future, although at the same time, of course, we should oppose their agenda. But opposition isn't enough, just as urban policy shouldn't be left to one level of government. Today I want to illustrate the complexity that's there with a very specific example of a key challenge facing today's urban planners: the mismatch between areas of population growth and areas of employment growth. The 2013 State of Australian Cities report identified that population growth in Australia was strong in the middle and outer rings of our cities where housing was more affordable. But it also noted that the decline of manufacturing and the rise of knowledge-intensive industries meant that jobs growth was concentrated in and near CBDs. For the first time in decades, population and jobs growth are not geographically aligned. The report said this: this can create spatial polarisation and pockets of social disadvantage. We're witnessing in practice the rise of a new phenomenon: drive-in, drive-out suburbs where people cannot afford to live near their workplace. We hear a lot about the policy implications of fly-in, fly-out communities, but far less about the much greater number who live in drive-in, drive-out suburbs. This trend is changing lives in ways that cause real concern. Allowing this trend to continue is a recipe for entrenched inequity and economic stagnation. There are many policy issues at play here: housing affordability, land supply, job shortages in the suburbs, inadequate public transport, access to education and training. It requires a considered national response. It requires policy leadership and involvement of all levels of government working with the private sector. I'm particularly attracted to consideration of the 30-minute city concept that's promoted by some policy thinkers in this area, including the Bus Industry Confederation. I'm aware that some argue for the 20-minute city, but better to under-promise and over-deliver. It's a simple concept that most people's day-to-day work, educational, shopping or recreational activities should be located within 30 minutes walking, cycling or public commuting from their homes. The national government can provide leadership in urban policy in cooperation with other levels of government, with industry and with the community. Here's 10 ways. 1. Investing in properly integrated transport systems involving both public transport and roads. 2. Investing in active transport solutions which connect up with public transport, education and employment hubs. 3. Addressing housing affordability through the use of urban planning, land supply and use of incentives. 4. Aligning greater housing density with public transport corridors. 5. Promoting jobs in outer suburbs. This can be through direct investment such as the Badgerys Creek Airport project and the Moorebank Intermodal, or by giving consideration to incentives for location of business. 6. Promoting jobs growth in middle rings around cities by investing in research precincts around universities and hospitals. 7. Supporting connectivity and productivity through fibre to the premise national broadband network. Let's do it once and do it right. 8. Supporting renewable energy, including buildings and precincts that produce their own power in new developments. 9. Enhancing sustainability and resilience of household and industrial water supply and rehabilitating our urban waterways, which for too long were used for industrial waste. And 10. Cooperation between governments to promote the development of second or third CBDs so that we decentralise jobs growth. A comprehensive approach is about building on success to make our cities more and more productive. An Infrastructure Australia report produced in 2013 neatly summarised the potential productivity gains to be extracted from policies that bring workers and their workplaces closer together. Good economic policy as well as good social policy. It said this: Higher density residential areas can offer more affordable housing options with better access to services and employment and support more livable, vibrant communities. Success in our cities is also a virtuous cycle where higher living standards draw global talent, attract global business and investment and boost trade opportunities. In short, this agglomeration of activity results in bigger effects than the sum of their individual parts. A future Labor government will pick up where its Labor predecessors left off. When Labor took office in 2007, we inherited a government that had no urban policy, no planning expertise and no structure through which to deliver policy. So we built one from the ground up. We started by establishing the Major Cities Unit. We created Infrastructure Australia. Our aim was to break the nexus between the infrastructure investment cycle, which by definition is long-term, and the short-term election cycle, which by definition is 3 or 4 years. We invested more in urban public transport than all our predecessors since Federation combined. Projects such as Noongar to Seaford Rail Extension, Gold Coast Light Rail, Perth City Link, Victorian Regional Rail Link and Moreton Bay Rail were promised, funded, built and either opened or at least underway on our watch. We produced the National Urban Policy, Our Cities, Our Future, to guide future government action. We appointed the Urban Policy Forum to get people in the private sector to help drive the implementation of that policy and to hold the government to account for what we said we would do. We worked with states and territories through COAG, which appointed Brian Howe and Lucy Turnbull to oversee the development of capital city plans. We created the Australian Council of Local Government as the nation's first forum for direct engagement between the Commonwealth and local government. We introduced the Livable Cities program, offering councils financial support for projects that contributed to improving life within their local community. We initiated the Suburban Jobs Plan to support states and territories plan the development of employment precincts, manufacturing hubs and multifunction developments near residential areas. We didn't just talk the talk, we invested. When we came into office, Australia was ranked 20th in the OECD for investment in infrastructure. When we left, we were ranked first, 20th to first in just 6 years. No wonder Tony Abbott spoke about wanting to be the infrastructure PM. He inherited the right approach, which he's now dismantling. In summary, we established the means to identify problems, we built capacity within the Commonwealth bureaucracy, and we worked with other levels of government and the private sector to deliver better outcomes. That's Labor's approach, and it stands in stark contrast to our successes. The current government has raced away from urban policy at light speed. In 12 months, the government has abolished the Major Cities Unit, attempted to water down the independence of Infrastructure Australia, cancelled all Commonwealth investment in urban public transport that was not under construction, including withdrawing from the Infrastructure Australia-approved Melbourne Metro and Cross River Rail projects, handed out $3.5 billion in advance payments for the East-West project in Melbourne and WestConnex in Sydney that aren't under contract and haven't had published cost-benefit analysis. The current government has no minister with responsibility for cities, no policy and no engagement. The government has insisted that its roads-only approach will leave space for states to invest more in urban rail. This argument has already collapsed in the face of reality. Given a choice between building a road with Commonwealth co-funding or a rail project without a funding contribution, states are not surprisingly opting for the former, as the Productivity Commission said they would do, as common sense dictates they would do. Labor doesn't oppose building roads. In government, we doubled the roads budget and we built or rebuilt 7,500 kilometres of roads. But Labor believes in building both roads and rail. We support an integrated transport system, something you can't deliver unless governments work together across transport nodes. I want to look briefly at the context of Tony Abbott's exclusive support for road funding over public transport, as outlined by himself in writing in battle lines, so you know you can believe it. In that book, Tony Abbott described public transport as the following: generally slow, expensive, not especially reliable, and a hideous drain on the public purse. He went on, quote, "There just aren't enough people wanting to go from a particular place to a particular destination at a particular time to justify any vehicle larger than a car, and cars need roads." While it's absurd that Joe Hockey thinks that poor people don't drive cars, it's even more absurd that Tony Abbott thinks nobody wants to take public transport. From the sublime to the ridiculous, there is no issue too big for Tony Abbott to show just how small his worldview is. He enjoys what John F. Kennedy once called the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. While I'm convinced that the former Labor government was on the right track on urban policy, winding back the policy clock to 2013 won't be enough. We need new ideas. In government, Labor created the Urban Policy Forum as the vehicle for engagement with stakeholders. But the current government has yet to convene that forum after more than a year, and its disinterest in cities and proper process has not been missed. In July, in an important speech, BCA Chief Executive Jennifer Westacott said that urban development should be elevated to the top of our social, economic and political discourse. Jennifer Westacott is spot on. Coming from a business perspective, she can see that effective urban policy is a key to unlocking productivity gains. Mr Abbott stands isolated amongst Western leaders with his disinterest in cities. Rather than mimic the UK with appointing knights and dames, he could do worse than mimic David Cameron's engagement with cities policy. Well, if Mr Abbott doesn't want to listen, Labor does. And today I announce that the opposition will create a new national urban policy dialogue to contribute to the urban debate. I'm pleased that key stakeholders in business, industry, other levels of government and academia have agreed to participate. Indeed, every single person who's been asked an organisation has said yes. There is a yearning for engagement in cities policy and we'll provide it. The dialogue's deliberations with Bill Shorten, myself and key shadow ministers such as Chris Bowen and Mark Butler will help to guide Labor's thinking as we finalise our policy for cities going forward. For example, I'm keen to engage business on the opportunities for greater development of regional cities as well as our capitals. Beyond our capitals, we have 10 major regional communities with more than 100,000 residents. The Gold Coast Tweed, Newcastle, Wollongong, the Sunshine Coast, Geelong, Townsville, Cairns, Toowoomba, Albury, Wodonga and Launceston. Ballarat and Bendigo aren't far behind. Each of these cities has untapped potential for growth in economic activity, potential enhanced by the NBN and the opportunities it provides for decentralisation. Prosperous regional cities will take pressure off the capital cities and boost national productivity. One way to drive that prosperity is to proceed with planning for a high-speed rail line between Brisbane and Melbourne via Sydney and Canberra. Completion of this project would revolutionise interstate travel, allowing people to travel between capitals in as little as 3 hours. It would also be a shot in the arm for regional centres along its route. High-speed rail could provide genuine opportunities for companies to relocate from a capital city to a regional city, including this one. In government, Labor allocated funding to establish a planning authority for high-speed rail and to begin to secure the corridor. Whilst the current government dumped that plan, a returned Labor government will continue to pursue high-speed rail for what it is, a game-changing nation-building project. Labor would also return to the promotion of sustainability in cities through more effective building design. Our Australian Urban Design Protocol, Creating Places for People, together with the rating tool for infrastructure sustainability, were examples of the Labor government working with the sector to deliver practical outcomes. As the philosopher Aristotle put it more than a few years ago, men come together in order to live, but they remain there to live the good life. Quality of life or livability matters. If we want people to live in suburbs of increased density, we need to ensure that cities are energetic, diverse and vibrant places rich in human experiences. This doesn't just mean improved design standards for new homes, apartment blocks and public buildings, but a more thoughtful approach to how we create and manage the spaces in between. Our urban spaces need to put people first so that they feel safe and comfortable about moving around our cities. As Danish architect Jan Gehl puts it, first life, then spaces, then buildings. The other way round never works. Rather than city buildings simply being offices or residential towers that exclude outsiders, greater use of mixed precincts should incorporate retail or entertainment options. We should show more imagination so the spaces between their buildings include areas to gather and engage with others. We should encourage more public art and green spaces in cities. Greater diversity in urban design generally makes for more vibrant cities, particularly if we focus heavily on mixed-use precincts. We also need to make it easier to get around so that more people want to walk, cycle or use public transport. Another example of a way to encourage this trend is to provide more bicycle racks at train stations and end-of-trip facilities in workplaces. On Perth's new CityLink rail line, funded by the former Labor government, lock-up bike sheds have been built on the platforms so that commuters can secure their bike with a swipe card before boarding their train. That's a small cost for an initiative that's making a real difference. We should also have a national conversation about the role of motorcycles and scooters, which are the fastest growing form of motorised transport. Recent European studies suggest truly extraordinary improvements in congestion through a greater reliance on motorcycles. A 10% increased uptake of motorcycles and scooters results in a 40% reduction in urban congestion. As well as seeking new ways to encourage greater population density, a Labor government will renew its focus on stimulating jobs growth in the outer suburbs of our cities. One example is to focus on infrastructure projects that attract business, like the planned airport at Badgerys Creek. An airport is the only piece of transport infrastructure that employs more people once completed than during construction. It drives employment across a region in logistics, in tourism, in the supply of goods and services. The idea of livability plugs directly into another area that will receive much more attention from the next Labor government: support for communities. In some parts of Australia with relatively high population density, people live within 50 metres of dozens of people they've never met. People want to feel that they live in a community, not just in a collection of buildings that happen to be in the same vicinity. We need not only to see a more efficient economy that produces jobs and prosperity, we also want a richer society, one that takes full account of the human elements of city life. People want to be part of something that's bigger than themselves. They want to belong. It's the reason we barrack for our favourite footy team. This week I'm more than distracted by the fact that my beloved South once again just one game away from our first grand final since 1971. When we were kicked out of the comp, there were some who said we should just follow another team. They didn't get it. It's tribal. It's about our sense of identity. It's about who we are. This spirit of community is something that people also want from their cities. Governments that embrace and respond to this need will find the community a willing partner. Earlier this month, I attended a community meeting at Millers Point. The Baird government wants to sell about 300 public housing units to wealthy investors for a one-off windfall profit. I grew up in public housing myself and went to school with mates from Millers Point, so I understand the sense of pride and connection that these locals have with their community. In this part of the world, people knock on doors to check on the welfare of their elderly neighbours. They might be poor in financial terms, but they are rich in their sense of belonging. When Mike Baird looks at Millers Point, he sees dollar signs. When I look at Millers Point, I see people, families and a community. We can and we should do better. People deserve respect. Successful cities are not disconnected enclaves of wealth and disadvantage where people's wealth determines their postcode. Successful cities are inclusive cities. Stronger communities doesn't necessarily mean more government. In some cases, it will mean less. In many forms, civil society is taking its own action. Just look at the growth in the share economy, the extraordinary growth in car share schemes, the Uber taxi schemes, Airbnb homestays, are challenging traditional markets. This internet-enabled intimacy is driven by human imagination and ingenuity that operates beyond the traditional state. But it is government policy that determines access to high-speed broadband that's the facilitator of this initiative of individuals. Those who argue for the government's second-rate broadband scheme on the basis that it's all we need today are behind the pace already being set by civil society and underestimate the capacity of human endeavour and the pace of change. Like the computer executive who once argued there would never be a mass market for home computers, they will be embarrassed by history. Today I've outlined a framework for where Labor is at 2 years out from the next election. American author Mark Twain once noted that, and I quote, "You can't depend on your eyes when your imagination is out of focus." Well, when it comes to our cities, legislators need imagination. The imagination to envisage cities which are dynamic, productive, sustainable, connected and vibrant. Cities which are centres of opportunity. Beyond imagination, decision makers also need commitment and capacity. Commitment to deliver and capacity to bring local communities, business and Australians with them on the journey. Our cities will grow in coming decades. Whether that happens in a planned way or by accident is up to us. I thank you for your attention today.
Thank you very much, Anthony Albanese. Let me ask you the first question today. Chairman of the Productivity Commission just a couple of weeks ago gave a speech to an infrastructure investor forum in Melbourne, very critical of some of the past actions in infrastructure announcements by politicians, saying that very often there was a major announcement followed by a long gap while they worked out how to do it. But he did say that he thought there were signs of an improvement in that process. Do you think that's true?
I'm certainly of the view that the Infrastructure Australia model was about just that, about making sure there was a pipeline of projects, an annual report to the Parliament about the different stages that projects were at, ready to proceed through to shows promise, 4 different categories. And what that meant is that projects, 15 out of 15 that were on the Infrastructure Australia priority list, got funded, including projects like the Majura Parkway here, the Hunter Expressway, Goodwood to Torrens rail project in South Australia that's a freight project. All of those projects, I think, would have struggled under a system that was based upon politics because, quite frankly, there were no seats going to be won or lost on the basis of that investment. But they were the right investment and we funded every single project. What worries me is that that slipped. And in legislation that is before the Parliament today, indeed, there's a proposal to have cost-benefit analysis of projects which receive government funding of more than $100 million. The problem with that is they're going to provide the money first and then do the cost-benefit analysis. That's what the legislation does. And in paying in advance, for example, for the East-West project in Melbourne, $1.5 billion has already been paid to the Victorian Government in advance last financial year for a project that not only isn't clear in terms of its final design of Stage 2, but which isn't under contract and isn't ready to go. So we need 2 things. One, proper cost-benefit analysis prior to funding being approved, and the second is milestone payments so that you actually pay based upon delivery. If those 2 things happened, which are both consistent with coalition policy, then we would, I think, advance substantially on the sort of agenda that the Productivity Commission and others have suggested.
Thank you. The next question is from Laura Tingle.
Laura Tingle from the Financial Review. Mr Albanese, I notice in your, this is a very Financial Review sort of question, I've noticed in your speech you've talked about 10 ways to provide leadership in urban policy. 2 of them involve the use of incentives in housing affordability and for location of business. Are you talking about tax breaks here? And does that sort of also raise, as a second question, the broader question, which is that a lot of what Labor was able to achieve in its 6 years in office was linked to the funding available in the envelope of responding to the global financial crisis, and that you would actually have a much bigger problem if you won government at the next election?
Well, I think dealing with the global financial crisis, some would regard as a problem that we had to deal with, and we intervened there and make no apologies for that, and I believe that it is one of the great things about the record of the former Labor government. With regard to incentives, of course, there are a range of ways in which you could achieve that outcome of encouraging location of business. Some in terms of direct investment of where government offices are. Here, for example, in the ACT at Woden and Tuggeranong, you have offices and CBDs other than at Civic, and perhaps Civic suffered a bit because of it, but because you have more than one CBD, not just where there are workplaces, but where there are entertainment precincts as well, people are able to live close to where they work and engage in that local community. So I think there's a range of examples that can be given. Secondly, in terms of investment and for any costs that some proposals might incur to the Commonwealth, if you have policies that boost national productivity and therefore boost revenue to government, then you can actually have investment that has a cost-neutral bottom line outcome in terms of the budget. And that's the key to infrastructure investment. Unlike other expenditures, handing out particular benefits, infrastructure provides a return to government, and that's why the IA process has been so important in terms of cost-benefit analysis, making sure that you fund projects that were only on the priority list that produced a positive return to government.
There's a question from Simon Gross.
Simon Gross from Canberra IQ. Your speech outlined what is, for want of a better term, a philosophical difference between Labor and the Coalition in this area, and that's about the federal government's involvement in city policy. You would have a federal government more actively involved in the planning and shaping and funding and the political kudos from things like what are basically, in many cases, small urban public transport projects. So why doesn't federal Labor trust the states and territories to plan and run their cities properly?
Because they've been in them. Quite frankly, urban congestion, if left unaddressed, according to Infrastructure Australia, would cost, in its first report, would cost the national economy $20 billion in lost productivity since by 2020, if we didn't do anything. So in many cases, they're major projects. The regional rail link in Victoria is a $3.225 billion Commonwealth investment, with $1 billion from the Victorian Government, a project that is enhancing the inner western suburbs of Melbourne, but also enhancing Bendigo, Ballarat and Geelong. It's stacked up in terms of providing that return. So many of these projects can be major and can provide a significant boost. To give credit where credit's due, the current government has chosen Badgerys Creek as the site for the second airport. It has also provided some funding for roads, but it hasn't provided any funding for the rail line that needs to link up from the existing South West rail line up to the main Western line, and therefore provide benefit for not just people travelling to and from the airport, but for citizens of Western Sydney as well. When Brian Howe and Lucy Turnbull examined the capital city plans, most of them were frankly not up to scratch, and therefore I think there is a role in the Commonwealth not just funding a particular project, but looking at a plan and how it fits together with employment, with housing, with community infrastructure, how it makes a city work and function better. If they don't do that, you have outcomes that are by accident, And what we've seen is a tendency for housing growth in the outer suburbs of our cities without thinking, where are they going to work? Where are they going to go to hospital? Where are they going to go to school? What are the social and benefits from people who live in those communities, which is why we have these drive-in, drive-out suburbs that mean that it is a tragedy that many parents, working parents, are spending more time in their car going to and from work than they do at home with their kids.
Next question is from Sid Marr.
Hello, Mr Albanese. Sid Marr from The Australian. You'd be aware that Julia Gillard's book came out today. And in it, just a couple of things wouldn't mind touching on if I could. One of the things she discusses is your role. You were always a Rudd supporter, but you worked diligently for Gillard as Prime Minister. But she cites the idea that critics saw you as a double agent, and in the book she talks about the fundamental conflict between his role and his loyalties, and goes on to say that, you know, if
she dismisses that. I've read the book. I've read that bit.
Well, there you go. So I guess very good. I guess I want to know how.
Thank you to The Australian for Matthew Franklin.
I guess I just want to know how you feel about that perception that is discussed in the book. The second thing that arises in the book, which has come up in various Labor discussions, is how to treat the Greens. Was too much given to the Greens in the deal after 2010, and how should you treat the Greens going forward?
Two big issues there. On the first, of course, people have their critics, but the fact is that Julia Gillard is a friend of mine. She remains a friend of mine. Kevin Rudd is a friend of mine, remains a friend of mine. I'm about looking towards the future. I was loyal to the Labor government and to the Prime Minister of the day each and every day. Anyone who observed Parliament must know that that is the case. When there was an issue and some hard yards to be done, guess who got handed the ball? And I did it each and every day. Might I say, if the entire caucus was concentrating on the needs of the Labor government rather than internals every day, then I might be here without shadow before my portfolio. So that's my view. I put my views out there very publicly. People know that that's the case, and Julia knows very clearly what my view was, and I remained a confidant of her, and the sort of information that I had access to at the centre of government, every day, meant that was there anything, any time that I wasn't being loyal, people would have known about it, because Julia would certainly have known about it. She had my trust totally, and I was loyal to her and I was loyal to Kevin. That's notwithstanding the fact that I put on the record that the events of June 23rd, 2010 was an error that led to 2 Labor Prime Ministers losing office.
The Greens?
The Greens. I forgot about the Greens. I try to forget about the Greens. I'm talking about the real issues. And the real issue is that. The real issue is you have 2 political parties in Australia that can form government. I, for the life of me, don't understand why people would endeavour so hard to, be involved in the Greens political party and not seek to gain power rather than lobby and influence decisions. And that is important. It is important, I believe, that Labor stand on our own. I think we should be prepared to cooperate and have discussions with the Greens political party, with the coalition, with any people who don't agree with us. I'm someone who's, I think, in terms of when you're writing my bio, Sid, you'll say that. I was prepared to go out and talk to people who don't believe in climate change. I was prepared to talk to a whole range of people who disagree with me and treat them with respect, do it in a tough way from time to time. But I think there's no doubt that, in hindsight, the Greens press conference that was held was damaging to the government. I don't know what Julia says about that in the book, but there's no doubt that that's the case. But that's in hindsight. The fact is that Tony Abbott would have done whatever he could and whatever was necessary to form government in 2010. Tony Windsor's put that on the record in pretty colourful language, and I'll leave it at that.
James Massola.
Mr Albanese, James Massola from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age. A couple of questions, if I may. First of all, since Labor moved to opposition late last year, Bill Shorten has adopted a very small target strategy, opposing almost everything the Abbott government does and announcing next to no policy. Today you're here announcing an actual policy. I'd almost forgotten what that looked like from Labor. Why is that? Is this an implicit criticism of Labor's approach in opposition to date? And secondly, will you categorically rule out being a candidate for the leadership at the next election if Labor loses the coming election?
Look, a couple of questions in there. One is that Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen and others saw an early draft of this speech. I tend to change things, including in the car on the way down, and some things while I've been standing up here. But they certainly approved of the speech, and Bill Shorten is very committed to making cities one of the key issues from now up until the lead up to the next election. And I think in terms of we're just 1 year into opposition. You can't expect fully detailed policies to be out there. Tony Abbott had none. He didn't have a policy that said he was going to cut health and cut education and cut pensions and engage in rip all money out of public transport. He had all of that. So with regard to the future, I believe if the election is this Saturday, Bill Shorten will be elected Prime Minister. I'll tell you what my objective is. It's not to be Leader of the Opposition, it's to be Minister in a Labor government. And that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do in the lead up to the next election.
So, in answer to my second question?
I think I answered it.
Next question is from Tony Melville.
Tony Melville, Director of the National Press Club. I'm a bit of a fan of the ABC program Utopia on the fictional infrastructure department, and I watched the Very Fast Train episode, and I wasn't sure whether it was a mockumentary or a documentary at times, but there were two things. Do you watch the program? Would you offer them any ideas for future scripts? And just on that idea, the Very Fast Train, they talked a lot about the difference between feasibility studies and scoping studies. I think the scoping study had more charts and was a bit thicker. Seriously, on the point of the Very Fast Train, that documentary certainly said that it's never going to happen, and it's a waste of time even to think about it.
Well, you know, it's a big issue, and big issues require vision and guts. And we set up, one of the things I tried to do in government is to make progress so that they didn't just stop with a change of government, whether it be the nature of the Infrastructure Australia Board with people like Mark Birrell appointed to it, no former Labor politicians, whether it be the capital city coags plans with Brian Howe and Lucy Turnbull appointed in terms of that process, whether it be here in terms of the work that we're doing in terms of the urban policy dialogue, but on the high-speed rail. I had Tim Fisher, Jennifer Westacott, from the BCA. They did the report. It wasn't something that was a Labor document. It was something that had, for example, from Sydney to Melbourne, a cost-benefit ratio of $2.15 for every dollar invested. This is serious policy. Why is it hard? Because it's hard for politicians to think beyond the political cycle. That's why it's hard. But I'm convinced that Bill Shorten will win the next election. He'll be the Prime Minister. I'll be a minister in his government, and we'll set about progressing that issue, which is about setting up an authority that deals with the different government jurisdictions, that's about preserving the corridor. If you have a look at the detail that's there in the report, I think it's a very exciting project. And all of the major Western industrialised nations are doing it, as well as our neighbours in Asia, in China, in Japan, of course. And in terms of the benefits of it, I think it is a worthwhile project. I don't argue that you can do it in a day or a year. It's a long-term project, but as population increases as well, can you imagine when the population, is double what it is today? Can you imagine double the number of vehicles on the road and double the number of planes in the sky from Sydney to Melbourne? And it'd be more than that, of course, because with increased wealth, it would be many times that. So I think it's a practical response to that. And notwithstanding the fact that much of Utopia is, I think, very funny. I think it's a well-written show. I suspect they're getting assistance, not from myself, but from others who've been engaged in various processes, be it in Infrastructure Australia or in my department. But I'll leave the government to work out where some of the stuff is coming from. But I have a good chuckle.
Question from Peter Phillips.
Mr Albanese, Peter Phillips, one of the directors of the National Press Club. A little bit less than a year ago, just after his election as leader of the Parliamentary Labor Party, Mr Shorten was here, gave an address, and amongst other things that he went to was the then membership of the Australian Labor Party, which nationally, he said at that time, stood at about 44,000. So my question then, and against the background of your ringing declaration to Sid Marr in response to his question just a little moment ago, is one, how is the membership of the party now progressing in numerical terms? And two, is the rift, which was so characteristic of so much of what the two preceding Labor governments were about, is the rift really healed, and can the Labor Party go seriously, convincingly to, first of all, the three elections in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, and then to the next federal election in a very convincing manner?
Well, I think the next election in Victoria, Daniel Andrews deserves to be elected Premier of Victoria. He's got a vision, and I know Daniel very well. New South Wales and Queensland, of course, are more challenging. They come from a fair way behind. But I have no doubt that you'll see outstanding results from both of those governments. In New South Wales, I think after 4 years, people will be wondering, what all the fuss was about, a do-nothing government. There was concern, obviously, about some internal issues that have been played out in terms of New South Wales. But I think people will have a look at the revolving door that is not just ICAC, but the O'Farrell and Baird government ministries. They've got more people than the Queensland caucus sitting on the crossbench in New South Wales. I think people will look at that government and say they had an enormous opportunity after 16 years of Labor government to come in. If you can't have an alternative vision implemented after 16 years, what were they doing? What were they doing? Well, we know what they were doing. They were meeting developers, a lot of them, and getting brown paper bags in cars, and then give you evidence saying, I wasn't sure that was against the rules. I reckon someone gives you a brown paper bag with cash in it at the back of a car, you kind of know it's not on. I think people will wonder in New South Wales, they're not going to get better. This is the best the coalition can offer in New South Wales, and it's been pretty ordinary. ALP membership. I think we need to reform more. I'm a reformer. The direct vote that was given to the party membership for the leadership created a position whereby you have an engagement with the party. One of the reasons why we're so strong now, I believe, is that we went around the country, Bill and I talked about a positive vision for the future. What would normally happen after a Labor government loses office is a bit of what happens now, people writing books and trying to fight history wars. We weren't interested in that. We were interested in the future, and we talked to the membership about it, and they engaged. We went around this time last year, on the Monday morning after the AFL Grand Final, we had a barbecue in a park in Perth after the Dockers had lost. 500 ALP members turned up at 9 a.m. the day after that game to listen to myself and Bill and engage about the party's future. Incredibly positive. We need to trust people. Give them a vote. Give them a vote. Extend it. I think it should be extended far more. And in order to give people power, you've got to take power from others. And that means factional power brokers, myself included, giving up power on behalf of the membership. And this isn't just about internals. That is one of the reasons why Tony Abbott vacated the space. I think that was a big mistake. And during that period, you had myself and Bill on the TV every night talking about the future. That's one of the reasons why, as well, the structure that we put up means that there isn't any internal tension. There can't be. Bill Shorten will lead us to the next election. I think he will be successful. And when people write the history books about how Bill Shorten became Prime Minister, they'll look back to a press conference with Kevin and me in the blue room saying, we're going to, and support, just to damage Sam's career, support from Sam Dastyari as the party secretary in New South Wales and others who said, we're going to just crash through on this. A lot of people didn't like it. We're going to give the membership a vote. And it made a huge difference. And when the history books are written, that will be, I think, a precondition of the success that we are having as an opposition.
Let's go back to Laura.
Laura Tingle again, Mr Albanese. Just following up from my earlier question about incentives and things, having just been up at the G20 Finance Ministers meeting in Cairns, the entire world is talking infrastructure, but it's essentially talking about how you engage the private sector in infrastructure, and you've addressed that in part talking about Infrastructure Australia. But what you seem to be saying essentially that it's really about engaging and directing private sector finance into infrastructure projects. And does that make you all that different from what the coalition is actually trying to achieve?
Well, we actually did it. In last year's budget, we announced 3 major projects. The F3 to M2 link, a project involving $405 million from the Commonwealth, $405 million from the state as a guarantee, and a project that will be done by Transurban. They're now called that North Connects. This new government seems to think if you give a project a new name, they can call it a new project and claim credit for it. So it's now called North Connects. But that was an example of a way of harnessing private sector investment. We also had on Cross River Rail and Melbourne Metro, importantly, they were joint projects between the Commonwealth and state that had been negotiated out with Queensland and Victoria, but which involved private sector investment as well. And we had superannuation funds lining up, pushing each other out of the way to invest in those projects. Now, the government walked away from the latter two. The former project, the F3 to M2 or North Connects, we signed the contracts with the state government way back in June of 2013 and with Transurban, so they were in place. So I think it's a matter of mobilising investment in terms of the private sector, and it's good that they agree with that concept. But the difference is that when you look at the G20, or I went to Cities Conference in Singapore in June, the whole world is also talking about sustainability. It's talking about public transport. It's talking about the way that cities are designed. And you can't have that perspective if you just stand up and do this nonsense rhetoric about roads of the 21st century. I mean, seriously, roads of the 21st century. 21st century infrastructure isn't just about roads being isolated from where people live, where people work, from public transport. It's an absurd proposition that they have, and I certainly think, not only do I think that, the Business Council of Australia thinks that, all of the Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, the Urban Development Institute of Australia, the Property Council of Australia, they all think that as well. And I look forward to engaging with those organisations and others in terms of the urban policy dialogue, because I think there is a void there that the current government has left. When there's a gap, I'm prepared to run through, not quite with the style of Greg Inglis, but I'll run through it nonetheless.
Simon Gross.
speaking of Mr Inglis, it's towards the end of September, so let's get out and put this policy stuff away and talk about football. Now, I proudly say that I hope Souths eat shit and die.
Security.
Why do I say that? Because I'm a Balmain supporter. You said you're a reformer. When it came to the need to reform the rugby league system, Balmain and many other foundation clubs bit the bullet, and we went to bed with our ancient rivals, in our case, the evil Western suburbs. Souths acted like they were above it. A few flaky celebrities, a bit of Homes of Court money, and you've actually maintained standalone status. It's not justified unless you can justify it right here now.
Well, that is an extraordinarily provocative question, and one that might get a different response were it not with cameras around. But can I say this? Yes, Balmain rolled over and amalgamated and got rid of their brand. And wasn't that a good decision? I think that was disappointing. I was on the South board. I was a director of South at that time, and during the period in which we came back, and that created some tension. Had a bit of tension from time to time with News Limited. That was tense at the time, and people understood the argument about change. We basically said there was a little sticker, SSTID, South Sydney Till I Die. We weren't about to go and change the brand, and I think that is important. I mean, one of the things, to bring it back to the speech that I spoke about today, is that sense of community. One of the things that concerns me about some people in public life is they seek to reduce everything to a commodity that can be priced. That's what Miller's Point's about. If you're an economic rationalist, you know you have a house that's worth $3 million and you sell it and you build 5 houses somewhere else to make that up. That seems on the surface to be okay.